eighth in a series of Zoom lectures sponsored by Congregation KINS. As many of you know, STEM typically stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and we have added an M to it to stand for both medicine and psychology. And in fact, the presentation today will involve psychology. The speaker today is our assistant rabbi, Rabbi Yechiel Bresler, and he is also my very helpful technical expert in facilitating this lecture series. His topic today is using COVID-19 as a case study for the role of mental health in Psak Halacha. Rabbi Bresler grew up in St. Louis, attended local day schools and yeshiva high school there. After high school, he went to Israel and studied at Yeshivat Shalavim for 2 years, then attended Yeshiva University, graduating with a bachelor's degree in accounting. Rabbi Bresler received smicha from Yeshiva University, then went on to earn a master's degree in mental health counseling from the Ferkauf School of Psychology at Yeshiva University. As I mentioned earlier, he is our wonderful assistant rabbi. He is also a clinician and the assistant director of a school-based program for Madrigos Midwest, which is a local organization. Rabbi Bresler and his wife Davina are the proud parents of 2 sons, Tani and Sachi. They live right here in West Rogers Park. And in addition to Rabbi Bresler's devotion to family and Jewish community, he is also a lifelong Cardinals fan. We have forgiven him for doing that. And as he told me earlier, that should make for some very interesting opportunities in Chicago. I would like to go ahead and turn the program over to Rabbi Bresler. If you have any questions for him, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask your question. Rabbi Bresler.
Thank you very, very much. First of all, I just have to thank Dr. Karish. It's programs like these, which if all I have to do is be the tech guy for a few minutes before it starts, it makes our show really, really thriving. Having the lay leadership step up and create what honestly is probably one of the more popular shiurim. And it's really incredible. So thank you for the dedication and the time and efforts and all the work you're doing for that. It's very, and when I've been able to join, it's been extremely enjoyable. As Dr. Karish mentioned, my topic today is using COVID-19 as a case study for the role of mental health in Psak Halacha. And before we begin, I will share my screen in a minute with a PowerPoint presentation. But before we begin, I do need a couple to give a couple of disclaimers. The first is that I have smicha and I'm a rabbi, and certain questions I can answer, but I am by no means what we would consider a firm halachic posek. So when I talk about the role in Psak Halacha, it is not coming from my own experience as a posek, but as you will see, we will be exploring a couple of texts and of tshuvos, really, of responsa in regards to these topics. So just that's disclaimer number one. Disclaimer number two is anytime you talk about psak or you talk about either of these topics or talk about mental health, every case is extremely case specific. So as we'll see, every case we talk about needs to be, these are just some of the general rules, and I want to highlight that there is a place in halacha, there is a place in Torah that mental health is absolutely significant and plays a role in real psakim and real halachic situations. But every case needs to be determined on its own. Every case needs to be determined the severity of the case, the individuals of the case. There needs to be doctors involved, psychologists involved, rabbis involved. Every case really is case specific. And of course, depending on the severity of the shaila, of the issue at hand, obviously we'll need different expertise. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. There we go. Okay. So again, topic is using COVID-19 as a case study for the role of mental health in Psak Halacha. So the first issue that comes up right away, and again, a very, very sensitive issue, which we talk about, but we have a pasuk of v'chai bohem. This is true across Torah, across Halacha, right? The Torah is meant to be something which we live with, right? It is very rare. We know the three exceptions: Gilui Rayos, Shfichos Damim, Avodah Zarah, right? Illicit relationships and Avodah Zarah and murder are the situations where, yeah, we have to give up our life. But short of that, or short of very, very rare times in history called the Shas Shmad, where they are trying, the government is trying to eradicate, the Jewish religion and Jewish practice, then even other things involved. But assuming we don't live at that time, which thank God we're not, and assuming that we're not dealing with one of those three situations, everything else, we have a pasuk, b'chai bohem, you should live with the mitzvahs, perform the mitzvahs. We have a mitzvah to live and keep the Torah, v'lo sheyamus bohem, and not that we give up our lives. And that is true as well when it comes to mental health. There are certain shilos which are very clear-cut, life and death, God forbid, right? We talk about cases of suicide, of people taking their own life. It's called in Halacha. It's absolutely a tragic situation, and absolutely, we obviously has clear levels of pikuach nefesh, clear status of any other life and death. Of course, that involves that knowing when that is a reality, of course, is requires some background and understanding of how do we determine that. The basic rule, like every other case, is safek pikuach nefesh. If we have any doubt whatsoever, then we err on the side of saving a life. So if there's someone whose life is at risk, God forbid, if someone's at risk of taking their own life, then that has clearly the halachic status of any other case of pikuach nefesh. But what about short of that, right? So we'll talk about we can talk about this for hours, and there are plethora of cases, but I chose a few which popped out to me that I just want to share, and hopefully we can adapt from there. So we'll talk about first some corona cases. Mental health as a whole during this time of COVID has gone through the roof. At the beginning, a lot of people actually, we found, were dealing better with it, right? People who had general, let's say, anxiety, right? Actually, towards the beginning of it, we're faring relatively well because they felt like others joined them on the boat. They felt like now it's not just me that's anxious, it's everyone's anxious. The whole world is anxious, right? But of course, as this has continued to hang around a lot longer than we anticipated, some of the challenges have gone up. So loneliness, issues of abuse as well. I'm sorry, getting some feedback. If everyone could just keep themselves muted, please. Okay, unmute. Good. Go back to share screen. Excellent. Okay, present. Very good. Where are we at? There we go. Okay, right. So we've seen an increase certainly in loneliness, right, from everyone, right? Cases of abuse, God forbid, are really a terrible, terrible situation to be in right now. People with family dysfunction, right, with dysfunction in their home, it's much harder, especially during times of isolation, to keep that going. Issues of addiction, right? People who struggle with this as a whole when they're locked up and they're isolated, right? So it becomes much more, and the list goes on and on and on. Mental health during this time has really been something which is on the focus on many, many people. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll talk about other mental health considerations independent of COVID as well, where we'll see some situations relevant to halacha. So the first case here, this is a tshuva. I did cut out some of it just for the sake of keeping it relatively short, but I took the snippets. If anyone wants the full thing, I'm happy to send that to you. It's also in Hebrew, but I just figured to go through the English would be a little bit more efficient. And this is from Herschel Schachter Shlita, who has, of course, been on the front runner in our world for sure, dealing with psak and questions of, in general, halachic questions in COVID. And right at the very beginning, he was speaking about issues of mental health. And so what about the case he asks of calling a lonely or ill individual on Shabbos? Obviously, typically, we cannot call anyone on Shabbos, right? Of course, whether it's a D'Rabbanan, D'Oraisa, but certainly we cannot do it, right? But let's assume now we're talking about even something Michal Shabbos D'Oraisa, right? So he writes here, if the government or physician has decided that an individual must remain in isolation over the course of Yom Tov, he was writing this before Yom Tov, the same would be true for Shabbos, and this individual has a psychological condition, where physicians who know this patient have determined that there is a possibility. Notice he says possibility. We're not talking, right? Even a suffix, even a doubt. We're not talking about something which is for sure someone, God forbid, is going to take their own life or going to be in a terrible, tragic situation. Even if there's a possibility that this person being alone over the course of Yom Tif would be in a situation of pikuach nefesh, as he writes here, possible suicide. If the individual was not able to communicate or speak with family members, then, writes Rav Shechter, the family member must reach out to this person. Not may reach out, must, right? We have an obligation because, of course, keeping Shabbos is a tremendous priority of us. But as we said, when we deal with pikuach nefesh, so then one has an obligation to go ahead and to reach out to this person on Yom Tif to speak on the phone or use the internet by leaving a connection open before Yom Tif. Rav Moshe Feinstein has decided that in certain circumstances, psychological danger is considered life-threatening. I'm happy if anyone wants it. It's a different context. It's not for now. If anyone wants that to see that source of Rav Moshe Feinstein, I'm happy to send it to you. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva where he again, in a different context, but says this idea that undoubtedly when one is confronted with intense psychological challenges and danger, then that has the same rules, as we've said, as any other life-threatening situation. That's not such a chiddush, that's not something so novel that we wouldn't have expected. I think that's pretty logical. However, the next step is even more intriguing. And here it says Rabbi Soloveitchik went further and noted in the name of his grandfather, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, that even if there's a concern that someone will lose his or her mind, even if their life is not in danger, that too is considered a case of pikuach nefesh. So the way I understand this, and he says in the Hebrew as well as maybe a little bit more clear even, which is that we're not talking about here a case of, God forbid, suicide, or there's even a risk of suicide. But what we are talking about is that if a person is alone and that person has either preconditions or not, but is in danger of going crazy, literally, right? Again, we're not talking about, as he'll emphasize, we're not talking about just someone being sad or lonely, which is, we feel bad for them as well, right? And everyone is experiencing this on some level. All of us have loneliness on some level, disconnect from some outside source. But if there is someone who will lose his or her mind to the point where they will, sheshigaon, he writes in the Hebrew, they will literally go meshuga, we say, right, in a real way, right? That it will impact the rest of their entire life in that way. So that alone is considered already pikuach nefesh. If a person is physically ill and alone, and the physicians have determined, the physicians meaning medical doctors, but also psychologists, have determined that there is a possibility of the condition deteriorating further to a point of being life-threatening, and whether physically or mentally or emotionally, then the family must remain in contact using electronic devices with that person over the course of Yom Tov in order to check on the person's well-being. So, in other words, what he's saying so far is that certainly, as we mentioned, if there's a possibility that, God forbid, the situation will bring someone to such intense loneliness that, God forbid, they will, be in a risk of taking their own life, certainly that's considered pikuach nefesh, right? But even short of that, if they won't necessarily be at risk of taking their own life, but they will be at risk of losing their sanity, literally, then that is also, says Rav Shechter in the name of Soloveitchik, who quotes from his grandfather, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, that is also considered a status of pikuach nefesh, even if it's not their physical life, but their mental status, their sanity takes on a status of pikuach nefashos. And of course, that is probably the primary point where we need real trained medical doctors, as well as physicians, as well as psychologists, to be able to determine. Because however, he says here in the next paragraph, if someone is not as ill as described, however, they must be confined and alone because of the circumstances related to the coronavirus, then they may not use any electronic devices in order to connect the family members on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So there's a limit to all of this. Yeah, if someone is at risk of going insane, or if someone is at risk of, God forbid, being in a situation that they'll take their own life, for sure we can be in contact with them on Shabbos via internet, via phone, whatever it is. However, says Rav Shechter, that needs to be determined, because anything short of that, if a person is lonely, right, as he says, although it is painful and sad to be alone, people want to be with family and friends. This is not a sakanos nefashos, a life-threatening situation. And in that case, there is no place to allow a violation of Shabbos and Yom Tov. So certainly, mental health takes a place of pikuach nefesh. Whether that means taking one's life, whether that means one's own sanity, certainly that's true. But again, that needs to be determined on its own level, every case specific, because anything short of that, while a person may experience sadness, sadness is not the same as depression, right? Sadness is not even, there's mild depression versus major depression, and versus someone who is risk of taking their own life, are all very different realities. And we don't have time to go into all the details now of how to determine what's what. But, right, but the reality is, if someone's in that case where it's sekanas nefashos, then that's no different than anything else. If someone is in a situation where they're sad or they're lonely, then we need to do everything we can to make them happy, to cheer them up, to reach out to them, etc. But that does not qualify as a sufficient to allow the desecration of Shabbos or Yom Tov. So that's case number one, probably most extreme case that we'll talk about. The second issue where this came up was, in terms of music during Sfira, music during the 3 weeks. We know that typically it's prohibited. So both Rav Asher Weiss and Rav Shechter addressed this. They have somewhat similar statements, but slightly different. This is Rav Asher Weiss's tshuva. This, of course, is in Hebrew, and we won't read the whole thing now. I don't want to go take up all the time, but basically he says, he says what's interesting. He says, first of all, I've seen Rabbanim, he writes, who during the whole situation of coronavirus are saying everything's allowed, right? No problem. Don't be sad. Everything's okay. Just do what you need to do. And he says, and he says, if anything, the opposite. He says, when we have a magifa, when we have a plague, and we're going through a virus like we've never seen before, or at least in our lifetime, right? When we're going through, he says, the opposite. Not that we should try to be more makel and lean and everything. He says we should be mechazik. We should strengthen our emunah. We should take on more chumras. We should be more careful with our avodas Hashem, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to strengthen that. So he says, so to just, make sweeping statements of, all this stuff is allowed. He says, I don't agree with that. However, he says, every situation needs to be determined. He says, certainly, right? When he says, if an individual is at risk of, and this is not even at risk of taking one's own life, but this is just at risk of someone being particularly sad or down, or God forbid, falling into a depression, right? Then one would be allowed to listen to music during Sfira. Then what we should be lenient, right? So certainly he says there's room for that leniency when one is experiencing that. However, he was not a fan of making sweeping statements that during coronavirus, all these bets are off, right? That wasn't his approach. He said he's seen people doing that. He doesn't agree with that. But certainly on a case-by-case situation, if someone is experiencing that, then absolutely we should be more lenient and permit in that case. And Rav Shechter on the same topic addresses it as well. And he writes here, he goes through the different levels of mourning, and he writes here that that during this, he talks about the history of the prohibition of listening to music during Sfira as it relates to different levels of mourning. And then he says, during this time of global suffering, it would appear that for some individuals, notice he says some individuals, he's not making a sweeping rule either, but for some individuals, refraining from listening or playing music may leave one in a state of sadness or emotional distress, right? Music, we can have a whole share on music as well, right? Music is important to many, many people. It uplifts our mood, right? So he says, so if one is in a state of sadness or loneliness or emotional distress, given the global suffering and the pandemic, so then, yeah, it would make sense that for such an individual, we be lenient and they're allowed to listen to music. This would appear to reach beyond the intent of this restriction. He says that, right, goes well beyond. So of course here, the severity of the prohibition that we're talking about, right, is we're talking about a minhag, right? We're talking about something which is a custom versus what we were talking about previously of being mechal Shabbos. So obviously every situation and what the severity of the halachic that we are quote unquote transgressing would be, right, would also impact how lenient we can be, right? If we're dealing with the threshold of being lenient for breaking Shabbos is going to be much more life or death versus what it takes to violate a minhag, right? But nonetheless, a minhag is a minhag, and we take that very seriously. But as he writes, if someone needs to listen to music, then that would certainly be permitted. If the motivation, here he writes, if the motivation to listen to music is not to put oneself in a cheerful mood, but rather to ease the tension or pressure in one's home, and to help bring oneself back to a normal disposition, that would be permissible. One should still avoid listening to very cheerful music, right? So he said, right, this isn't a be-all end-all, similar to like Rav Asher Weiss was saying. This isn't like, sure, the prohibition is off for this year, that the minhag is lifted. No, a person has to know themselves. A person has to understand, am I doing this? Oh, it's COVID, but so now I'm, anything is go ahead. No, that's not accurate, right? What they're saying is that if one is particularly sad, or he doesn't write here of Shechta, but Rav Asher Weiss in his Truva does specify a situation when people are home with little kids, and we want to have a positive atmosphere in the home, and you want to cheer up the kids. So then, yeah, that is appropriate, right? Because we needed that push, we needed that ability to be able to keep the happiness in our home. We see how important our spirits and our happiness and our joy and our typical level of disposition, right, would be is important. So certainly that would be allowed. If one is doing fine, and if one doesn't need it, then still they should have, right, they should avoid listening to very cheerful music, or even to music at all for some people, right? But again, one must know themselves in this type of situation. But certainly we see that the poskim are being very cognizant of this factor of mental health, right? Of where am I at? Am I very sad? How sad am I? Is my life in danger? Do I have children? Right? All of these factors are extremely relevant to determining how lenient can we be, and should we be, and must we be, right? But certainly we see very clearly from these shuvos that mental health has very much been on the minds of the poskim. There's a similar tshuva here I'm not going to go into now, but that talks about the same idea of music during the 3 weeks that Rav Shechta wrote, and it was very similar to the one he wrote during Sfira, obviously for different time periods. So that's as it relates to Corona, right? So we've seen, right, dealing with people's loneliness, being Michal Shabbos or Yom Tov for it. Right? Of course, we all heard about the famous discussions about a Zoom Seder or not a Zoom Seder. Again, the same guidelines would be true. Most poskim were not a fan of Zoom Seder at all, unless, God forbid, we're dealing with someone of a life and death situation. So those are some of the situations of Corona. I'd like to share a couple of other cases also as it relates to mental health in Halacha in general. So one case which the Rabbi Asher Weiss talks about, the Stipler Gaon talks about this, many poskim talk about, what about an OCD? So OCD is as follows: obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, so what that means is that people with OCD have compulsive behaviors that, even no matter how irrational they are, right, one may not do. So this comes up in many cases. One classic area this comes up is if someone's at home going to sleep at night, right, to lock the door. So do they get up at night 50 times to go downstairs to make sure it's locked? Of course, there's realm of normalcy. It's normal to go ahead and double check the doors before you go to sleep to make sure that doors are locked at night. But if a person is in bed and they're not able to sleep because they're so worried that, God forbid, they left the door, unlocked and someone's going to come in, right? So that would be what we would call OCD. And this shows up all over the place. And that's just a little bit of background about it. So we find it that people have this as well in the realm of religion, right? In particular, the Stipler and Rav Asher Weiss both dealt with really the same issue, which is they had young men, or people, yeshiva bachrim, or people or asking them shilas, what happens? I have this obsessive compulsive disorder. I say Shema, but I need to make sure I said the word exactly right. Right? Sometimes we all are familiar with Laman Tizkiru, because there's actually halachic basis to make sure we're saying the Zion, say it right. So there's halachic basis that Mishnah Berurah quotes that one should emphasize the Zion, that it's Tizkiru. Sometimes you'll hear it over and over again, right? Or, right? So what happens if I didn't do that? They want to know, right? What should I do? So look at what the Stipler Gaon writes here. This is translated. He did not write it in English. But it's also fascinating to see the insight of some of our Gedolim into the realm of mental health. It says, I instructed him that he should pray from a prayer book, and whatever he had already passed should not be repeated under any circumstances, even if it is clear to him that he said it incorrectly or that he skipped words. It is clear that as a matter of Jewish law, he is not obligated to recite these words any longer. However, he says, but you cannot explain this to someone whose nerves are stretched on this matter. In other words, he's right. He's saying you can't rationally explain it, right? To someone who has OCD, to rationally try to explain to them why maybe they really did say the words, or why they wouldn't be, why they would no longer be obligated, to try to give them explanations. This is the appropriate approach from a mental health perspective as well. The whole challenge with obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety as a whole is questioning. Well, maybe. How do I know for sure? Right? The goal is they're trying to accomplish to knowing with absolute certainty for 100%. And obviously, none of us can know anything 100%. We all live with a certain realm of doubt. For people with obsessive compulsive disorder, that doubt is very challenging for them. So to try to rationalize to them, they don't understand. So therefore, he says, you must say this to the person with great certainty and without offering any explanation, other than the explanation that there is no concern of transgressing a biblical prohibition. I cannot elaborate on it at this time. One should rule from that anything has been said should not be said again. So in other words, what he's saying is, say it once and go on. If you think you didn't say it again, doesn't matter. Keep going. You cannot go back and repeat it, because that's how you overcome it. And we see very clearly the role in halacha. And he has a similar idea. He has a similar psak by Hilchos Nida, that he talks about a young married man who comes to a posek with shilas, questions related to showing them a color, trying to get a psak of dam nida. Is the wife tahora or tamea? And he says that the Rav needs to tell the husband she is tahora. Of course, if that's the psak, but assuming that's the psak, and he keeps coming at that and saying, but this, but that, are you sure you saw this right? All these questions. So they need to be very clear to give a psak. This is the psak, and I cannot elaborate it further. If I determine she's tahora, and I cannot elaborate it further, right? The same idea that we see even in the interactions between a posek and an individual, that the mental health must be considered, right? Similar to the tshuva that the stipler had in regards to someone being able to repeating the words of Shema. Rav Asher Weiss has a similar tshuva, that this is regards to a young man who was unable to concentrate reading the Shema. So he's worried, I didn't have the proper kavanah, I didn't have the proper intent when saying Shema. Maybe I wasn't yotze. So what happens? All day he's sitting there repeating the Shiloh he's repeating the Shema over and over again. He can't get anything else done because he's sitting there in shul all day, right? Saying, maybe I didn't have kavanah. So listen to what Rav Asher Weiss says. It is my custom in these cases to tell him that he need only say the words in the siddur. Even if it seems to him that he is not concentrated, he should continue further. For deep inside, he knows what he has said if he understood Hebrew. And even if he does not understand Hebrew, nevertheless, his reading is an act of accepting yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And in this way, he's fulfilled his duty of saying the Shema. It is forbidden, says Rav Asher Weiss, to give him reasons or explanations. For every reason that he is giving, he will undermine, to contradict, and reject completely whatever he was told. When he appears undecided, he should be told decisively without any reasons at all. And after all of that, one needs a lot of help from heaven, and may God have mercy on him and send him a complete recovery. Right? For people who have a severe situation of OCD, it can be quite crippling. Right? So he davens for refuah for them as well. Right? But he says it's forbidden to give them reasons. Why? Because that is very in line with the appropriate treatment that one would get in a therapy for someone who has this OCD. And so we see again, you can't get stuck. You got to keep moving. And so therefore, that's Rav Asher Weiss's tshuva, similar to the Stipler Gaon. So we see very clearly that how both Rav Asher Weiss and the Stipler Gaon were in tune with the relevance of mental health. So much so we're talking about here Kabbalah's Ol Malchus Shamayim. But yet they say, don't go back. You cannot go back. You got to keep going. Similarly, I heard in the name of Bachashav Rav, but will remain nameless for other reasons. But in regards to, right, we have general halachas. Let's say when it's, as it pertains to saying Mashiv Aruach Umar Geshem, or the Saint Halamotar, right, or Yalav Yav, or any of these situations where, Yalav Yav is not a good example. Let's say the Saint Halamotar or Mashiv Aruach, right, where if one, generally the halacha is, if one forgets it, they have to go back, right? Now, what happens if one is in doubt? So the rule is, if one is in doubt whether or not they said Mashiv Haruach Morida Geshem, so the halacha is that within 30 days of changing, we assume that they kept their old habit, because we have halachic sources and we have more secular sources as well that tell us it takes 30 days to change a habit, right? And so if that's the case, so we assume within 30 days that you did whatever your old habit was. And therefore, if one has doubt whether or not they said Mashu Ruach within 30 days, so then we assume they did whatever they were used to have done. So if they were used to not saying it, then within 30 days, if they have a doubt, they would have to go ahead and repeat Shemona Esrei. However, if one has obsessive compulsive disorder, so then I heard in the name of a chashav posek that that one who has OCD, that if they have a doubt, then they don't have to repeat it. They only repeat it if they know for sure that they didn't say it. If they have a doubt, they wouldn't have to repeat it. Why would that be the case? The reality is that would be the case. It makes a lot of sense because someone who has this obsessive compulsive disorder, everything seems like a doubt, right? It's always going to be a doubt. It's going to be very rare that they know for sure they did say it. So unless they knew for absolute certainty that they should not go back and repeat it. So that's another instance where we'll see the mental health become relevant very clearly for dictating halacha and psak halacha. Okay, and here's a quote from Rav Nachman Bresler that talks about Chomer de Pesach. Very often, when it comes to Pesach, people get very, very nervous. Everyone in Klal Yisrael gets very nervous, but especially people who have anxiety, who have obsessive compulsive disorder, have to be very cognizant because, yeah, we want to be machmir, but to take it to an extreme is not appropriate or healthy either from a mental health or from a halachic perspective. And therefore, Rav Nachman says to be cautious of that. So we see very clearly again, right, all of these situations where we have certainly cases of, God forbid, risk of suicide or one taking one's own life. Clearly the rules of, as Rav Moshe said and Rav Shechter said, right, that clearly the rules of Pikuach Nefesh apply, right? Rav Soloveitchik, quoting from his grandfather, that even if one is, if there's concern of one just kind of losing their mind, that also is considered Pikuach Nefesh in its own right. Of course, there's this needs to be evaluated appropriately with the proper professionals. We can't just say, someone is going to be lonely or multiple people are going to be lonely, that we should therefore allow everything. No, right? We have to evaluate appropriately, right? Obviously, how severe the transgression is, whether we're dealing with a minhag, whether we're dealing with being mechal Shabbos, right? Obviously, is going to change the standard of how far we need to go with the mental health. But clearly, and then we see here also the cases of OCD, about Shema and about Nida that we spoke about, right? Clearly, the poskim are very in tune that mental health is a significant part of our functioning. And that means not always only in extreme cases of life or death, but even in terms of being in a normal disposition or being happy, rejoicing, being confident, being excited, right? Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, to serve Hashem with simcha is a tremendous mitzvah. And therefore, certainly they take into account what is one's mental health status in the realm of psak halacha. So it clearly does make a difference. But of course, each case needs to be addressed on its own right with the proper professionals and the proper poskim for each particular person and situation. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take any questions. If not, I'm happy not to.
If no questions, then Rabbi Bresler, if you'll be kind enough to remove your screen sharing.
Yeah, I think let me just.
I would like to show our audience something.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. So first of all, thank you for a very fascinating presentation. The next two STEM meetings, as you can see on this slide, will have the speaker, Dr. Jonathan Greer, and he is a PhD biochemist who has retired and is learning full-time. And he's going to be presenting for the next 2 weeks. The time will go back to the normal time of 12 p.m. And his topic next week will be, what is the history of our Torah, the actual timeline for receipt of the Torah. And on November 10th, 2 weeks from now, he will speak about the relationship between science and Torah. What is the view of science and Torah? Also, at any point in time, if you want to know what the upcoming topic is, simply go to the KINS website at concins.org, and there will be an announcement there. This is the remaining schedule from now through December 1st. And we expect to have some more speakers and more topics lined up after that point in time. I'd like to thank all of you for participating today. Any last minute questions for Rabbi Bresler? If not, thank you again. We'll see you next week, and I'm going to sign us off.
Thank you.
Thanks.